January 6th, 878. The frozen marshlands of Somerset, England. The smoke from cooking fires mixed with the morning mist as King Alfred of Wessex crouched in a makeshift shelter on the island of Athelney, barely 30 years old, ruler of the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom, now reduced to commanding a handful of loyal warriors in a sodden marsh. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had been celebrating Christmas at his royal residence in Chippenham, when Viking warriors under Guthrum had smashed through the gates in a devastating surprise attack. Alfred had escaped with his life by mere minutes, fleeing into the winter darkness with only a small band of followers, while the Danes butchered his household guard and seized his fortress. The most powerful king in southern England had become a fugitive hiding in swamps, his kingdom conquered, his people scattered or enslaved, his future measured in days rather than years. Most of England already lay under Viking control. Northumbria had fallen in 867, its kings slaughtered in battle. East Anglia had collapsed in 869, its king Edmund tortured and executed. Mercia, the great Midland kingdom, had been crushed in 874, its ruler fleeing to Rome in disgrace. Now Wessex, the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence, seemed destined for the same fate. German officers studying Alfred's campaign in 1940 would conclude that his position in January 878 was militarily hopeless. British military historians analysing the situation in the 1950s would describe it as the lowest point in English history before 1940, with comparable odds of survival. Yet within 5 months, Alfred would transform total defeat into complete victory. He would rally an army from nothing, defeat the most successful Viking force ever assembled, force its leader to convert to Christianity, and establish a peace that would last a generation. More importantly, he would implement military reforms so revolutionary that they would make England unconquerable, create the first true national defence system in medieval Europe, and lay the foundation for the eventual unification of England. This story is about how strategic thinking defeated tactical superiority, how one man's vision transformed disaster into triumph, and how the darkest moment in English history became the crucible that forged a nation. The Vikings had been raiding Britain for generations before 865, but those early attacks were opportunistic strikes for plunder. Monasteries burned, coastal villages were sacked, terrified populations paid tribute, and the raiders returned home with their loot before winter. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, divided and competitive, treated these incursions as nuisances rather than existential threats. Then everything changed. In 865, a massive Viking force landed in East Anglia with an entirely different purpose. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Danish and Norse warriors estimated at several thousand men, led by 3 legendary chieftains, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba. Unlike previous raiders, this army came to conquer and settle. They brought not just warriors, but support personnel, craftsmen, and the infrastructure for permanent occupation. The Great Heathen Army employed sophisticated tactics that the Anglo-Saxons had never encountered. They negotiated false peace treaties to buy time, accepted tribute payments, and then immediately violated agreements, seized fortified positions during winter when defenders were dispersed, and moved with speed that left traditional armies helplessly pursuing ghosts. Most devastatingly, they understood that divided Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would fall one by one if kept off balance. The campaign began with East Anglia in 865. The Vikings extracted horses from the terrified King Edmund, transforming themselves from a seaborne force into a mobile cavalry army. They wintered in East Anglia, building their strength while the other kingdoms watched nervously and did nothing. In 866, they struck north into Northumbria, arriving at York while the kingdom was torn by civil war between King Osbert and the usurper Ella. The Vikings captured York in a single day, establishing it as their stronghold. When Osbert and Ella finally united their forces to retake the city, the Vikings massacred them both. Northumbria ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler to extract taxes and moved south to Mercia in 867. They took Nottingham and wintered there, forcing the Mercian king Burgred to pay enormous tribute for peace. In 869, they returned to East Anglia and killed King Edmund in a battle near Thetford. Edmund would be remembered as a Christian martyr, but his death marked the complete subjugation of his kingdom. By 870, 3 of England's 4 kingdoms had fallen. Only Wessex remained. In 871, reinforcements arrived from Scandinavia, the great summer army led by Bagsec, swelling Viking numbers to unprecedented levels. The combined force turned its attention to Wessex, the richest and most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Alfred's brother, King Ethelred, commanded Wessex's defence. At Reading in December 870, the Vikings fortified a position between the Thames and Kennet rivers. Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred attacked but were defeated with heavy casualties. The brothers regrouped and 4 days later engaged the Vikings again at Ashdown in January 871. This battle would become legendary. According to multiple accounts, the battle plan called for Ethelred and Alfred to attack simultaneously from different positions. But Ethelred remained in his tent at prayers while the Vikings prepared to overwhelm Alfred's smaller force. Alfred, then barely 22 years old, made a decision that revealed his character. He attacked alone. Leading his men uphill against superior numbers, Alfred's forces crashed into the Viking shield wall with such ferocity that the enemy line buckled. The Vikings, caught off guard by the unexpected aggression, began to retreat. As they fell back, Ethelred finally emerged from his prayers and struck from the second position. The combined assault routed the Vikings, killing King Bagsec and 5 Viking jarls. Bodies littered the hillside for miles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes Viking warriors cut down in flight, pursued for hours across the downs. But Ashdown was an exception. 2 weeks later at Basing, the Vikings crushed a Wessex army. In March at Myrton, another bloody stalemate left both sides exhausted. Then Ethelred died, probably from wounds received in battle. At 22, Alfred inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His first act as king was to buy peace. He paid the Vikings an enormous tribute to leave Wessex, giving himself time to bury his brother, consolidate power, and rebuild his forces. The payment worked, but only temporarily. The Vikings withdrew to London, then moved north to Northumbria to suppress a rebellion, then back to Mercia where they finally destroyed that kingdom in 874, sending King Burgred fleeing to Rome. After conquering Mercia, the great heathen army split. Halfdan led half the force north to establish permanent settlements in Northumbria, creating what would become known as the Danelaw. The other half, led by Guthrum, Oscitel and Anwend, turned its attention back to Wessex. Between 875 and 877, Guthrum's forces probed Wessex's defences repeatedly. They seized Wareham in Dorset in 875, forcing Alfred to negotiate. He extracted oaths sworn on Viking holy arm rings that they would leave his kingdom. The Vikings took the oaths, accepted hostages, and promptly broke their word. They slipped away to Exeter, deeper into Wessex territory. Alfred blockaded their ships with a newly built fleet, the first Anglo-Saxon naval force. A storm destroyed the Viking relief fleet, forcing them to negotiate again. They swore new oaths in 877, accepted more tribute, and withdrew to Gloucester in Mercia. Alfred believed he had bought another respite. He celebrated Christmas 877 at his royal estate in Chippenham, 30 miles from the Viking camp at Gloucester. His forces were dispersed for winter, the traditional campaigning season over. His guard was relaxed. It was the greatest mistake of his life. On the night of January 6, 878, Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack. Viking warriors descended on Chippenham in the darkness, apparently attempting to kill Alfred and his council in one stroke. The attack violated every convention of medieval warfare. Armies didn't campaign in winter. Treaties were supposed to mean something. But the Vikings didn't respect Anglo-Saxon conventions, and Guthrum had learned that surprise was worth more than honour. Alfred escaped by minutes, fleeing into the winter night with a handful of followers. Many of his household guard died buying time for his escape. Behind him, Chippenham burned. The Vikings spread across Wessex like a plague. Without a king to rally around, resistance collapsed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that most of the West Saxons submitted to the Danes. Others fled overseas. Those who remained either accepted Viking rule or went into hiding. In a matter of weeks, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom had effectively ceased to exist. Alfred retreated to the Somerset marshes, to a small island called Athelney, accessible only by boat through treacherous waterways known only to locals. There, in the depths of winter, with a force reduced to perhaps a few dozen men, Alfred faced his lowest moment. Every kingdom in England had fallen to the Vikings. His nobles were dead, scattered, or had submitted to the enemy. His people believed him dead. His military system had failed repeatedly. By any rational assessment, the war was over and the Vikings had won. But Alfred didn't surrender. Instead, he began to plan. What happened in those marshes during the winter and spring of 878 would determine the future of England. The legends that grew around Alfred's time at Athelney have obscured the historical reality, which is far more remarkable than the myths. The famous story of Alfred burning cakes while disguised as a peasant, scolded by a farmer's wife who didn't recognise her king, is almost certainly invented. But the truth is more impressive. Alfred spent those months building the foundation for one of history's most remarkable military comebacks. First, he sent out messengers. Using local knowledge of the marshes and surrounding territories, his agents contacted surviving Theans, ealdormen and royal officials. The message was simple. Alfred was alive, he was fighting, and Wessex would resist. The response was slow but steady. By Easter 878, Alfred had built a fortress on Athelney, a timber stockade that served as his base of operations. More importantly, men were arriving. Ealdorman Ethelwulf of Somerset, one of the kingdom's highest-ranking nobles, appeared with soldiers and supplies. Others followed. The psychological impact of Alfred's survival cannot be overstated. Medieval warfare was deeply personal. Kings led from the front, and their deaths often meant immediate collapse of resistance. The fact that Alfred lived, that he hadn't fled to Francia like the King of Mercia, that he was actively fighting rather than submitting, gave his subjects something to believe in. But Alfred did more than just survive. He waged guerrilla warfare. From Athelney, his warbands emerged daily to raid Viking supply lines, ambush patrols, and attack estates of Anglo-Saxons who had submitted to Guthrum. These weren't large engagements, but they served multiple purposes. They kept Vikings off balance, prevented them from consolidating control of Somerset and the surrounding regions, provided Alfred's growing force with supplies and plunder, demonstrated that Wessex resistance hadn't ended, and most importantly, they bought time. During this period, Alfred also benefited from events beyond his control. A second Viking army landed in Devon, apparently intending to trap Alfred between two forces, but local levies, perhaps inspired by Alfred's resistance, managed to defeat this second force in a series of skirmishes. The Devonshire Vikings were forced to withdraw, eliminating one threat. By late April 878, Alfred had assembled a force of several hundred men, but Guthrum commanded thousands. Any direct confrontation would be suicidal. Alfred needed more men, many more, and he needed them organised and committed. He sent out a call for a general mobilisation, using a system that dated back generations. The third, the Anglo-Saxon militia system, required all free men to serve when called. But the system had always been problematic. Men served for limited periods, usually 40 days, before returning to their farms. This made sustained campaigns impossible. Moreover, mobilising the third took weeks, giving enemies time to strike and withdraw. Alfred gambled that enough men remained loyal and willing to fight despite months of Viking domination. In the 7th week after Easter, between May 4th and 7th, 878, Alfred rode to Ecgbertistan, Egbert Stone, east of Selwood Forest. This location was carefully chosen, on the border of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire, the three shires that formed Wessex's core. What happened next changed Alfred's life. The men came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that all the people of Somerset, Wiltshire and Western Hampshire who had not fled overseas came to Egbert Stone, and they rejoiced to see him. Thousands of men, farmers and craftsmen and minor nobles appeared with whatever weapons they possessed. They had lost their homes, seen their families killed or enslaved, lived under Viking occupation for months, and here was their king, alive and calling them to war. The psychological moment must have been extraordinary. Alfred had been living in swamps for 4 months. His forces had been reduced to guerrilla bands. Wessex had effectively ceased to exist as a political entity. Yet when he called, an army appeared. Medieval chroniclers don't provide precise numbers, but estimates suggest Alfred assembled between 3,000 and 4,000 men at Egbert Stone, enough to challenge Guthrum's forces on equal terms. The army camped at Egbert Stone that night. The next day Alfred moved them to Iley Oak, 7 miles from Chippenham where Guthrum's main force was encamped. The day after that, they marched to Edington. The location of the Battle of Edington has been debated for centuries. Multiple sites have been proposed, but most historians now agree it occurred near the modern village of Eddington in Wiltshire, about 3 miles south of the Westbury White Horse. The date was somewhere between May 6th and May 12th, 878, on the northern fringe of Salisbury Plain. Guthrum's forces occupied strong defensive positions. They had been in England for 13 years, conquered every kingdom they attacked, defeated every army sent against them. They were experienced, confident, and well-equipped. Many were veterans of battles across England and Francia. They knew how to fight Anglo-Saxon armies. The tactical details of the battle are frustratingly sparse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides only a few lines describing the engagement. Asser, Alfred's biographer, offers slightly more detail, but still leaves enormous gaps. What we know comes from these brief accounts and from understanding Anglo-Saxon and Viking battle tactics. Both armies would have formed shield walls, the fundamental tactic of early medieval warfare. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping shields to create a mobile fortress. The front rank held shields while the second and third ranks struck over or around them with spears, axes, and swords. Breaking a shield wall required immense pressure, either from superior numbers, flanking movements, or sheer ferocity that broke enemy morale. The battle raged for hours. Asser writes that Alfred's forces fought ferociously in dense formation, striving long and bravely against the whole Viking army. The shield walls crashed together repeatedly, neither side gaining advantage. Men fell, gaps opened in the lines, reserves moved forward to fill them. The noise would have been overwhelming, the clash of weapons on shields, the screams of wounded men, the shouts of leaders trying to coordinate movements. Then, somehow, the Viking line broke. Whether from exhaustion, casualties, or a successful tactical maneuver by Alfred, the Viking shield wall collapsed. When a shield wall broke, disaster followed immediately. Warriors who lost formation became individuals rather than a collective force, vulnerable to mounted pursuit and isolated attacks. The Vikings fled. Asser records that Alfred overthrew the pagans with great slaughter, pursuing them as far as the fortress at Chippenham. The pursuit was critical. A beaten army allowed to retreat in order could reform and fight again. An army routed and pursued became scattered bands easily destroyed. Alfred's forces chased the fleeing Vikings for miles, killing hundreds. The survivors reached Chippenham and barricaded themselves inside. Alfred immediately besieged the fortress. This was unusual. Siege warfare was not an Anglo-Saxon strength, and Vikings were experts at defending fortified positions. But Alfred had one overwhelming advantage. Chippenham had been taken by surprise in January, designed as a forward base rather than a long-term garrison. The Vikings had not stockpiled adequate supplies for an extended siege. After 14 days, Guthrum's forces were starving. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records they were brought to extreme depths of despair by hunger, cold, and fear. They sought peace. The terms Alfred imposed were unprecedented. Guthrum and 30 of his leading men would be baptized as Christians, with Alfred serving as Guthrum's godfather. The Vikings would withdraw completely from Wessex. Hostages would be exchanged. And critically, a formal treaty would establish boundaries between Wessex and Danish-controlled territories. 3 weeks after the surrender, at a church near Athelney, Guthrum underwent baptism. The Viking warlord who had conquered most of England, killed multiple kings, and nearly destroyed Wessex, renounced Odin and Thor and accepted Jesus Christ as his lord. Alfred gave him a new Christian name, Ethelstan, and embraced him as a brother in Christ. The ceremony was followed by 12 days of feasting at Wedmore. The conversion was certainly political for Guthrum, but it was also binding in ways modern audiences might not appreciate. Medieval baptism created genuine spiritual and social obligations. By accepting Alfred as his godfather, Guthrum entered into a relationship that demanded honour and loyalty. Breaking oaths sworn in baptism meant not just political dishonour but spiritual damnation. This mattered in the 9th century in ways difficult to fully comprehend today. Guthrum kept his word. He withdrew to East Anglia where he ruled as king until his death in 890. The two kingdoms traded peacefully. The formal Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, drafted around 880, established clear boundaries along the old Roman road of Watling Street, created legal equivalences between Anglo-Saxons and Danes within their respective territories, and instituted trade regulations and dispute resolution mechanisms. The Battle of Eddington saved Wessex. But that alone doesn't explain Alfred's epithet, the Great. Dozens of medieval kings won battles. What made Alfred unique was what he did next. Between 878 and his death in 899, Alfred transformed Wessex from a surviving kingdom into the foundation of England. He understood that military victory without structural reform meant nothing. The Vikings would return, and next time Wessex needed to be ready. Alfred's first priority was military reform. The traditional Anglo-Saxon defence system, the Fyrd, had failed repeatedly against Viking tactics. The Fyrd was a militia of free men who served when called, but returned to their farms after short campaigns. This created two fatal vulnerabilities. First, it took weeks to mobilise the Fyrd, giving Vikings time to strike and withdraw. Second, the Fyrd couldn't maintain prolonged campaigns because farmers needed to return home for planting and harvest. Alfred's solution was revolutionary. He split the Fyrd into two rotating divisions. At any given time, half the force was available for military service, while the other half worked their lands. This created in effect a standing army, the first in England since Roman times. When one division's term ended, the other took its place, allowing continuous military operations. Equally important, Alfred restructured the Thegn class, the military aristocracy. Previously, Thanes owed military service but on their own terms and schedules. Alfred made service obligations explicit and mandatory. Thanes who failed to respond to mobilization, orders faced loss of land and status. This created a professional warrior class always ready for deployment. But Alfred's most brilliant innovation was the burh system, a network of fortified towns that revolutionized defensive warfare in medieval Europe. The concept was simple, but the execution was extraordinary. Alfred would build or refurbish 33 fortified settlements, called burhs, distributed throughout Wessex so that no village or farm was more than 20 miles, one day's travel, from a place of refuge. When Vikings attacked, the rural population could flee to the nearest burh. The burh would be defended by a permanent garrison, while messengers summoned the mobile field army. This gave Alfred time to respond, exactly what had been missing in previous Viking campaigns. The burhs weren't just military installations. Alfred designed them as economic and administrative centres. Markets and mints operated within their walls. Roads connected them to each other and to the broader kingdom, and permanent populations of merchants and craftsmen supported the garrisons. This integration of military and economic functions was unprecedented. A document called the Burgel Heidage, compiled during or shortly after Alfred's reign, reveals the sophistication of the system. Each burh was assessed in hides, units of land taxation. The number of hides assigned to each burh determined the length of wall it had to maintain and the number of defenders it had to provide. The formula was precise, 1 man for every 4.5 feet of wall. This meant that Wessex could mobilise approximately 27,000 men for garrison duty, roughly 6% of the total population. The largest burhs were at Winchester, Wallingford and Warwick. Winchester's walls stretched over 6 miles. Archaeological evidence shows these weren't crude stockades, but sophisticated fortifications with deep ditches, high earthen ramparts, timber palisades, and in some cases stone walls built on Roman foundations. Some burhs were twin towns straddling rivers, connected by fortified bridges that blocked Viking ships from penetrating inland waterways. Construction of the burh system required enormous resources and organisation. Wallingford's defences alone required an estimated 120,000 man-hours of labour. Multiply that by 33 burhs and the scale becomes staggering. Alfred had to extract labour, materials and funding from a kingdom recently devastated by war. That he succeeded demonstrates extraordinary administrative capacity. But perhaps the system's greatest genius was strategic. Vikings relied on speed and mobility. They struck coastal or riverside settlements, seized plunder, and retreated to ships before defenders could respond. The burh system denied them this advantage. A Viking force raiding inland would find the population sheltered in fortified positions that couldn't be quickly stormed. The Vikings lacked siege equipment and expertise. Their only option was to starve the burh into submission, but this took time, and time meant the Anglo-Saxon field army would arrive. If Vikings besieged a burh, they became the target rather than the hunters. The system was tested in 1892 when another large Viking army arrived from Francia. For 4 years this force campaigned against Wessex, but they never achieved decisive success. Every time they tried to penetrate deep into the kingdom, they encountered fortified burhs that slowed their advance. Alfred's mobile forces, using the burh network as secure bases, harassed Viking movements constantly. The invaders were unable to establish permanent footholds, couldn't resupply freely, and faced coordinated resistance that previous Viking armies had never encountered. By 896, the Vikings gave up. Some settled in East Anglia and Northumbria. Others returned to Francia. The burh system had worked exactly as designed. Alfred also reformed Anglo-Saxon naval capabilities. Understanding that Vikings arrived by sea, he designed ships specifically to counter them. Alfred's vessels were longer and faster than standard Viking longships, carried more warriors, and had higher freeboards that made boarding difficult. While the Anglo-Saxon navy never achieved dominance, it could contest Viking landings and disrupt their supply lines, adding another layer to the defence system. These military reforms were expensive. Alfred restructured taxation to support them, regularised the collection of what had been occasional tributes into systematic revenue streams, assigned specific territories to support specific burhs, and created accountability systems to ensure resources were properly used. The administrative sophistication required to maintain this system was remarkable for the 9th century. But Alfred understood that military strength alone wouldn't preserve Anglo-Saxon culture. The Vikings weren't just conquerors, they were settlers who brought their own languages, laws and customs. Large parts of northern and eastern England, the Danelaw, were already thoroughly Scandinavian. If Wessex became militarily strong but culturally weak, it would simply become another Viking kingdom with Anglo-Saxon characteristics. Alfred launched an educational and cultural renaissance designed to preserve Anglo-Saxon identity. He was acutely aware that learning had collapsed during the Viking Wars. Monasteries, the centres of literacy and education, had been destroyed. The clergy could barely read Latin. Legal traditions were being forgotten. Alfred wrote in the preface to his translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care that when he became king, very few men south of the Humber could understand church services in English or translate Latin into English, and he could not remember a single person south of the Thames who could do so. At nearly 40 years old, an advanced age for beginning education, Alfred taught himself Latin. He personally translated or commissioned translations of essential texts, Gregory's Pastoral Care on Christian Leadership, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy on Ethics and Governance, Augustine's Soliloquies on the Soul and Knowledge, Orosius' History Against the Pagans providing Christian world history, and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, documenting Anglo-Saxon heritage. These weren't academic exercises. Alfred was creating a common cultural foundation for his people. By translating crucial texts into English rather than leaving them in Latin, he made learning accessible beyond the clergy. This was revolutionary. Most medieval rulers saw literacy as clerical specialization. Alfred saw it as national necessity. He established schools for both nobles and commoners. The sons of thegns were required to learn reading and writing as part of their education. Alfred's court became a centre of learning, attracting scholars from across Europe, including a Serre from Wales who became Alfred's biographer, and Grimbald from Francia, who helped establish educational institutions. Alfred also compiled and revised the Anglo-Saxon legal code, drawing on earlier laws from the kingdoms of Kent, Mercia and Wessex. His law code served multiple purposes. It established legal consistency across regions that had previously operated under different customs. It asserted Alfred's authority as supreme lawgiver, creating legitimacy for centralised governance. It protected the rights of all free men, not just nobles, creating popular support for his rule, and it grounded law in Christian principles, linking legal authority to religious obligation. The preamble to Alfred's laws is remarkable. He begins with the 10 Commandments, then traces legal tradition through Christian history to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, explicitly connecting his authority to divine will and ancient precedent. This wasn't just law, it was political theology, creating a framework where obeying Alfred meant obeying God's law. These legal reforms had practical impact. Previously, disputes were settled through blood feuds or local custom. Alfred's system created courts, standardized punishments for crimes, and established procedures for appeals. This reduced violence, increased predictability, and strengthened central authority. The military reforms, educational renaissance, and legal restructuring all served a larger purpose. Alfred was building a state, not just ruling a kingdom. Medieval kingship was personal. A king's authority came from his relationship with individual nobles, his military prowess, his generosity in distributing plunder. When a king died, the entire system had to be reconstructed around his successor. Alfred's reforms created institutional continuity that transcended individual rulers. The burh system didn't depend on Alfred personally leading armies. It functioned through permanent garrisons and standardized procedures. The legal code remained in force regardless of who sat on the throne. The educational system produced literate administrators who could maintain government operations. By 886, Alfred's strength allowed him to move beyond defence. When he recaptured London from Viking control, the event marked a turning point. London had been part of Mercia, not Wessex. By taking London and incorporating it into his kingdom, Alfred was expanding beyond traditional Wessex boundaries. More significantly, the capture of London established Alfred as protector of all Anglo-Saxons, not just West Saxons. He began styling himself King of the Anglo-Saxons rather than King of Wessex, a title that implied authority over English territories under Viking control. This was aspirational rather than factual. Alfred didn't control the Danelaw, but it signalled his long-term vision. Alfred's children would pursue this vision aggressively. His daughter Ethelflaed married Ethelred, ealdorman of Mercia, strengthening the alliance between the two kingdoms. After her husband's death, Ethelflaed ruled Mercia in her own right, as Lady of the Mercians. She was a formidable military leader who extended the burh system into Mercia and led campaigns against Viking-held territories. Alfred's son Edward the Elder succeeded him in 899. Edward combined his father's strategic vision with aggressive military expansion. Using the burh system as forward bases, Edward and Ethelflaed systematically conquered Danish-held territories in the Midlands. They built new burhs in conquered areas, garrisoned them, and used them as launching points for further expansion. By Edward's death in 924, Wessex controlled most of England south of the Humber. Edward's son Aethelstan, Alfred's grandson, completed the conquest by taking Northumbria in 927. For the first time, one ruler controlled all of England. Aethelstan styled himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English. The process of English unification that began in the marshes of Athelney in 878 reached completion less than 50 years later. This wouldn't have been possible without Alfred's foundation. The military system that allowed Edward and Ethelflaed to campaign continuously, the administrative structure that governed conquered territories, the legal framework that integrated diverse regions, the cultural identity that defined Englishness, all originated in Alfred's reforms. Alfred died on October 26, 899, at approximately 50 years old. Contemporary accounts suggest he suffered from a chronic painful illness throughout his adult life, possibly Crohn's disease or another digestive condition. That he achieved what he did while dealing with constant pain makes his accomplishments even more remarkable. The epithet the Great wasn't applied to Alfred during his lifetime. It appeared centuries later when medieval chroniclers looked back at Anglo-Saxon history and recognised what he had accomplished. Alfred is the only English king ever called the Great. The title reflects not just his military victories, but his comprehensive transformation of Anglo-Saxon society. In January 878, when Alfred crouched in Somerset marshes, England's future looked dark. The 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been conquered or destroyed. Viking armies controlled most of the island. Anglo-Saxon culture, language and political organisation seemed destined for extinction. A German victory in Britain appeared inevitable. 5 months later, Alfred had reversed everything. He defeated the most successful Viking force ever assembled. He established peace on his terms. He implemented reforms that made England defensible, and he began building institutions that would eventually unite the country. The contrast with other conquered kingdoms is stark. Northumbria fell to the Vikings and never recovered its independence. Its royal house was extinguished, its territories absorbed into Scandinavian kingdoms. East Anglia suffered the same fate. Mercia survived only as a dependent ally of Wessex. Only Wessex not only survived but flourished, and eventually conquered territories that had defeated it. The difference was Alfred. Not just his battlefield victories, though those were crucial, but his understanding that military success without institutional reform was worthless. German military analysis of Alfred's campaigns emphasises his strategic patience. After Edington, Alfred could have pursued complete military victory, attempting to reconquer all Viking-held territories. Instead, he negotiated peace, accepted partition of England, and focused on making Wessex strong. This gave him time to implement reforms, build the burh system, and create military capabilities that made future conquest possible. The Treaty of Wedmore and subsequent agreements with Guthrum established Danelaw as a permanent reality. Alfred recognised he couldn't eliminate Viking presence in England, but he could contain it, civilise it through Christianity and trade, and create conditions where eventual reconquest became feasible. Guthrum's conversion was central to this strategy. A Christian Viking king ruling under Anglo-Saxon legal frameworks was far less threatening than a pagan warlord. The gradual integration of Danish settlers into Anglo-Saxon society, a process that took generations, began with religious conversion. Modern historians debate how much credit Alfred personally deserves. Some argue that the burh system may have been initiated by his father or grandfather, that military reforms emerged gradually rather than through Alfred's conscious design, that Asser's biography exaggerated Alfred's accomplishments to flatter his patron, and that later medieval writers created a heroic image that doesn't match reality. These critiques have merit. We should be sceptical of hagiographic sources. Alfred certainly built on earlier developments, and later ages definitely embellished his legend. But the core facts remain undeniable. England was conquered in January 878 and free by May 878. The only significant variable that changed was Alfred's leadership. The burh system, whether or not Alfred invented it personally, was systematically implemented during his reign on a scale never seen before. The military reforms created capabilities that hadn't existed previously. The educational renaissance, legal restructuring, and expansion of royal authority all occurred under Alfred's direct involvement. When analysing leadership, we ask not what someone inherited but what they did with it. Alfred inherited disaster. He transformed it into triumph. That transformation required vision, courage, organisational skill, strategic thinking, tactical competence, and sheer determination. Alfred possessed all these qualities. The impact on European history was profound. If Wessex had fallen in 878, Viking kingdoms would have controlled all of England. The Anglo-Saxon language, culture, and political traditions would have been absorbed into Scandinavian civilization. England would have developed as a northern European power with strong ties to Denmark and Norway, rather than a distinct entity. The Norman conquest might never have occurred, or would have conquered a Viking kingdom rather than an Anglo-Saxon one. The English language, a fusion of Anglo-Saxon grammar and Norman French vocabulary, might never have developed, and modern English wouldn't exist in its current form. The constitutional traditions that England eventually exported to North America, Australia, and other colonies were rooted in Anglo-Saxon legal principles that Alfred preserved and codified. Common law, trial by jury, parliamentary government, all have Anglo-Saxon antecedents that survived because Alfred saved Anglo-Saxon civilization. This isn't arguing for historical inevitability. England could have developed differently if the Vikings had won, but it didn't because Alfred won. His victory in 878 and his reforms afterwards shaped trajectories that influenced world history for over a millennium. The Battle of Edington deserves recognition as one of history's decisive battles, not because it was large or technically sophisticated, but because its outcome determined whether Anglo-Saxon England would survive. The casualties were probably moderate by later standards, perhaps hundreds rather than thousands. The tactics were conventional shield wall combat, but the strategic consequences were enormous. In 1940, when Britain faced invasion, Winston Churchill invoked Alfred as a historical parallel. Like Alfred, Britain was alone, its allies conquered or neutral. Like Alfred, Britain faced an enemy that had defeated everyone else. Like Alfred, Britain had to resist from limited resources against superior forces. Churchill was drawing on a cultural memory of Alfred as the king who refused to surrender when defeat appeared certain. Whether 1940 Britain resembled 878 Wessex is debatable, but the parallel reveals how deeply Alfred's legend had penetrated British consciousness. He became the archetype of resistance against overwhelming odds, the leader who turned disaster into victory through determination and intelligence. Modern, military studies of Alfred's campaigns focus on his strategic innovation. He understood that defensive warfare required different thinking than offensive warfare. Previous Anglo-Saxon strategy had focused on meeting Viking armies in the field and defeating them. Alfred realised this played to Viking strengths. They were tactically superior, more experienced, better equipped. Fighting them on their terms meant losing. Instead, Alfred changed the terms. The burh system meant Vikings couldn't operate freely. Guerrilla warfare from Athelney demonstrated that defeat wasn't permanent. The split third created sustained military pressure. Alfred transformed the strategic landscape, making it harder for Vikings to win even when they won tactical engagements. This is sophisticated military thinking. It requires understanding that wars aren't won through individual battles, but through cumulative strategic advantage. Alfred grasped this in ways his predecessors hadn't. His education, his literacy, his study of history all contributed to strategic vision that transcended conventional medieval military thought. The cultural legacy is equally significant. Alfred's educational reforms preserved the English language at a time when it could have been replaced by Norse. His patronage of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a historical record compiled during his reign and continued for centuries afterward, created a continuous narrative of English history. His translations made English a language of literature and learning, not just everyday communication. The modern English spoken around the world derives from the West Saxon dialect that Alfred's court promoted. If the Vikings had conquered Wessex, English might have merged with Old Norse to create a different language, or been replaced entirely. Alfred's cultural policies ensured English survived and eventually thrived. His legal code influenced English law for centuries. Principles he established, such as the king's responsibility to protect all free men, limits on arbitrary authority, and the importance of written law, became foundational to English constitutional development. Later reformers, from Anglo-Saxon times through the medieval period to the early modern era, looked to Alfred's laws as precedents. In the 16th and 17th centuries, during conflicts between Crown and Parliament, both sides cited Alfred as the authority. Royalists argued he exemplified strong kingship. Parliamentarians argued his laws limited royal power. Probably both were reading their own biases into history, but the fact that they turned to Alfred at all demonstrates his lasting impact on English political culture. The Victorian era practically worshipped Alfred. In the 19th century, as Britain built a global empire, Alfred became a symbol of English racial and cultural superiority. Statues were erected, books were written, pageants were performed. He was presented as the founder of England, the saviour of civilization, the embodiment of English virtues. This Victorian interpretation was deeply problematic. It exaggerated Alfred's accomplishments, minimised contributions of others, and served imperialist ideology. Modern historians rightly reject Victorian hagiography. But in correcting Victorian excesses, we shouldn't dismiss Alfred's genuine achievements. He was neither the perfect hero Victorians imagined, nor merely a lucky survivor who got credit for structural changes he didn't create. He was a successful leader who faced catastrophic circumstances, developed innovative solutions, implemented them effectively, and changed history. The monks on Lindisfarne in 793, when they saw Viking ships on the horizon, couldn't have imagined that Viking raids would lead to comprehensive conquest 85 years later. The Anglo-Saxons who submitted to Guthrum in January 878 couldn't have imagined that by May their king would defeat the Vikings and establish a peace that lasted decades. Alfred himself probably couldn't have imagined in those desperate days at Athelney that his reforms would create a unified England within 2 generations. Yet all of this happened, not through historical inevitability or impersonal forces, but through human decisions, leadership, courage, and strategic vision. Alfred made decisions in 878 that seemed desperate at the time but proved historically transformative. He chose to fight when surrender seemed rational. He chose institutional reform over simple military victory. He chose education and culture alongside military strength. Each decision shaped England's future. The strategy that saved a nation wasn't a single battle plan or clever tactic. It was a comprehensive vision of how a kingdom could survive, strengthen itself, and ultimately prevail against enemies that had defeated everyone else. Alfred understood that winning required more than battlefield victory. It required creating a state that could sustain military pressure, maintain cultural identity, provide good governance, and inspire loyalty. He built that state from the marshes of Somerset. When Alfred died in 899, he left an England that was stronger, more unified, more literate, better defended, and more clearly defined than the England he inherited in 871. His children and grandchildren completed the military conquest he began. But the foundation was Alfred's work. The great heathen army that arrived in 865 seemed destined to conquer all of England. They defeated every kingdom they attacked. They killed multiple kings. They forced the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom to the brink of extinction. In January 878, their victory appeared complete. 5 months later, they were baptized Christians, withdrawing to East Anglia under Anglo-Saxon terms. What changed was Alfred. Not his army size, which never exceeded Viking numbers by much. Not his resources, which remained limited. Not even his tactical skill, which was competent but not revolutionary. What changed was strategy, vision, leadership, and the refusal to accept defeat. From the Somerset marshes to Egbert's Stone to Eddington to the construction of the burhs, Alfred transformed disaster into triumph through strategic thinking that was centuries ahead of its time. The thunder of shields at Eddington decided England's immediate future, but Alfred's reforms decided its long-term destiny. When the Vikings returned in 892, they found an England they couldn't conquer. When Alfred's grandson Aethelstan took Northumbria in 927, he completed a process that began with Alfred's survival in 878. The strategy that saved a nation in its darkest hour became the foundation for its greatest age. And the king who refused to surrender when all seemed lost earned the only title English history reserves for one man alone, Alfred the Great.